So the thing about this story is that when Luke would have been telling this story to his listeners, and when Jesus would have been telling this story in the first place, it should have shocked and disgusted them, okay? Because Pharisees are not bad guys. In fact, if anything, Pharisees were the goodest of good guys. Truly the goodest of good guys. And tax collectors were the baddest of bad guys. And Pharisees were the goodest of good guys because Pharisees were the guys who spent all their time and effort working to make Jewish life easier for Jewish people. Okay? So they spent all their time literally just trying to make life easier and better. And tax collectors were the guys who hung out with the Romans and extorted money from everybody. Okay? So with that in mind, here we go. If you were going to retell this story today, if Jesus were going to stand here now and he were going to try to update this for today, here's how Jesus might try and tell you this story. He might say something like, so, Obama and Trump walked into a church to pray. And Obama stood there and said, "Thank God I'm not like that guy." And Trump stood there and said, "I already know I'm not going to heaven. Please have mercy on me." Ouch, right? Yeah, I didn't like it either. I had to stop writing the sermon at that point and walk away for like 2 days. I had to set it aside for a little while. But it's that level of like, it kind of makes your stomach churn, doesn't it? Because I certainly want to be real mad at Trump. I don't really want to give him room. But that's the level of shock and disgust, right? And that's the level of discomfort that this story is supposed to carry. And the point is to wake you up a little bit. Jesus says that the one everyone assumes is righteous actually walks away totally unchanged, inevitably will be brought low, which is such a bummer because don't we all love Barack Obama to some degree? Even if we've got our complaints. And the one who is mindful and aware of himself, I already know I'm not going to heaven. We've all seen that video go around, haven't we? Asking for mercy, walks away lifted up. Really? Okay, so I'd like to propose that this like brought low and exalted concept, though admittedly we might enjoy fantasies of vengeance levels of brought lowness, might be more about being closer to or further away from wholeness. So not only is the story meant to just shock the hell out of you, but it's looping back in on itself because it's not just about who's right and who's wrong. It's actually about what kind of awareness opens us up to being fed by God in the first place. And if you want to be made whole, if you want heaven, you've got to participate in real-time self-awareness. The Pharisee, our Obama, stands tall and confident and composed, the person that everybody admires, but he's rehearsing what he already believes about himself. I'm good, I do things right, I'm not like that guy. And that seems like self-awareness, but what is it really? What it really is it's mostly just comparing himself to everyone else as a measuring tool. And frankly, I'm not sure God or Jesus cares about how we measure up to the person next to us, right? Whereas the tax collector, Trump, however, doesn't have a measuring stick beyond, I'm doing wrong, and I know I've done wrong. And maybe somewhere in there, I'm caught in this system, but this is the system I'm in. He's not doing any performative, I'm bad, but not as bad as. He just shows up raw and aware and vulnerable and honest. And he just says, I made mistakes, and I made poor choices. And maybe somewhere in there, he's also saying, I need help. Pharisee, narrating his own self-worth, maybe even just for his own self, out of his own fear, more even than for God. Whereas the tax collector is just being honest about where his need is. And that's where this gets really, really fascinating. Because what Jesus is describing here isn't just a spiritual reality, and it's not just like spiritual poetry. It's actually a neurological reality. Like, I was listening to a podcast this week, and I was listening to a neuroscientist and a theologian. And they were talking about how it turns out, literally, neurologically, the stories that we tell, especially our stories about things like God, literally shape our brains and prime us for certain ways of being in the world. For example, when we tell the Genesis story about Adam and Eve, and we introduce the idea that Eve sinned by engaging with this serpent and tasting this fruit, and that anything we do wrong results in being kicked out and falling further from God, we're introducing shame. We all know this. We're sitting in a UCC. Of course we know this. Most of us have thrown that away already, right? But here's the thing. When we do that, we're priming our brains to literally operate in small, defensive, and aggressive ways. We can look outside in the world and see probably how that's affecting our broader world, right? And when we tell stories like Jesus dies for all people because God needed some kind of blood sacrifice to feel satisfied, so God killed God's own son, there's fancy theological words for that. But that's also a story that we tell, some of us Christians. We're literally priming our brains for violence. And those brains primed for violence turn around and act in violent ways. There are literally studies that talk about things like Deep South and how Christian preachers would preach things like that, turn around, engage in a lynching, and then come right back and preach things like that some more. Brains literally primed for violence. Wow. So that brings us right back to our Pharisee. What kind of God stories do we think shaped his brain? Everybody thought he was probably a great guy. But the inner monologue, what kind of patterns had been etched into him? Stories about purity, reward, punishment, about who's in and who's out. The things that were controlling him into the external behaviors that made everybody think he was great. You can almost see it happening in real time. He's praying out of this brain space where he's performing his learned version of righteousness instead of opening himself to transformation, which might mean caring a lot less about what everybody sees and thinks. When we tell stories about wholeness, about how we are saved by engaging in conversations, in co-creating vulnerably, engaging with God and one another, kind of like this tax collector who just admits where he's struggling, what do we think is happening there? And turns out that that kind of storytelling, the kind where we look more critically at the stories and we recognize that Jesus isn't walking around like some magical magician who waves a wand and people are healed, where Jesus is a person who engages one-on-one with people in relationships. Those stories are the stories that work into self-awareness and development that is exactly what is scientifically required for our brains to begin to evolve beyond where we currently are toward higher thinking and higher learning and higher being. So to literally become mini gods who are becoming. That comes from Sister Ilia Dilio, by the way, who is a Catholic nun. I'll just put that out there for you. So even the Catholics, full of a little heresy. Essentially, if we want to become better and closer to God, the pathway to that is to humble ourselves through self-awareness. Ouch. That's how we end up being exalted. So you're picking up, I see the nods, so I can see you're picking up what I'm putting down. I have not completely lost you. That's great. So here's the thing, the Pharisee isn't a bad guy. He isn't a bad guy just because everybody doesn't think he's a bad guy. He's also not a bad guy just because he's got the wrong thought ideas. He probably just received stories and ways of understanding his world that were rule-based and probably pretty rigid. And maybe even an understanding of God that leans a little violent. And so he's standing there and he's talking about what he thinks truly is really important. And I bet we can think of some people in our world who are also like that, right? He's following the rules. He's not like them, and that's what's important. And in theory, he should feel pretty high and mighty, and maybe he does for a little while, but ultimately, he's not thinking about his thinking. Think about that one more time. Let me see how many words I can work the word think into a sentence. He's not thinking about his thinking. He's rehearsing the same pattern over and over until it hardens. He's gonna be made low because he's gonna be left behind. He's not gonna grow with this pattern or this behavior. He's not even giving the opportunity to grow with this pattern or this behavior. It's not all that unlike the faithless folk that we talked about last week with that persistence in prayer, but what kind of persistence? Is it vengeance-driven persistence? What's driving the content is just as important as the content itself, right? So, believe it or not, maybe we need to be more like the tax collector, even if he quit his job because it was really painful. Soft, aware, vulnerable, thinking about our thinking and our behavior as a result of our thinking, noticing where our need really is and being honest about it, at least with God. Maybe we can't be honest with one another, but at least we can be honest with God. And it might feel kind of low in the moment. It definitely doesn't feel good to acknowledge those realities. But at least that's the pathway to growth, and it's the pathway to evolution. It's the pathway to transformation. It's the stuff that brings us to wholeness. Because we live in a world that's trained to go straight to outrage and comparison and big responses, right? We don't like something, and what do? What are we supposed to do? I'm gonna get mad about it, we're gonna do something about it, right? Social media, politics, even religion, rewards certainty, punishment, performance. Those are brains and responses that are primed for violence. They're just primed for violence, and those are stories that keep us rigid and full of black and white rules and comparisons. These are the things that feel big and really good in the moment, and maybe even cathartic, but they will ultimately, in the end, keep us low. And that's exactly what Jesus means when he says, those who humble themselves will be exalted, and those who exalt themselves will be humbled. He's not talking about humiliation and self-deprecation. That's never what Jesus wants for us. He's describing that slow, sacred rewiring that happens when we trade comparison for curiosity, when we trade certainty for humility, when we trade outrage for just wondering and looking. All of these trades grow our capacity for love and for care. And all of those eventually become wholeness. And another word for wholeness, the Christian word that we use for wholeness, is salvation. Yeah. And we want that, right? That's the thing we want. So think about your thinking. And notice when you start narrating superiority and comparison and checking your boxes for correctness, because literally we all do it. I am constantly doing it, and I hate it every time I catch myself. Oh, it's so annoying. And I love to think I don't do it, but gosh darn it, I'm doing it all the time. And see whether in those moments when you catch yourself, because just the art of catching yourself, I tell you, is an art form, See when you catch yourself, if whether or not you can take a pause and just tell God, I found a rough part. Would you help me find wholeness instead of violence? That's all. And just see what comes, because that is literally how neuron by neuron, breath by breath, prayer by prayer, thought by thought, we let the Holy Spirit help us evolve. And then we slowly evolve our world. And that's how all of creation is exalted. And that's how all of creation finds its inherent sacredness. That's how we go and how we grow. Amen.